is at least a start. But with modern torture bans, we're able to really see an acceleration of the banning of torture methods, and interestingly, the approach is more or less 0 to 100. In every civilization and time period we've discussed, essentially all forms of torture were at least somewhat viable by the government, at least in some context. However, something we see in modern times is not just the ban for certain torture methods, but the ban for torture as a whole. One of the earliest notable advocates for the banning of torture across all of Europe is a man named Cesare Beccaria. He was an Italian philosopher and criminologist, and he was very vocal about his beliefs in torture being ineffective, unjust, and downright barbaric. And while he personally had no political power and wasn't able to enact legislative change himself, his views and opinions quickly spread across both European and American colonies, truly causing individuals to question whether or not torture had a place in modern-day society. And unsurprisingly, what followed the popularity of this thought process was a wave of torture abolitions across most and eventually all of Europe. Sweden, Austria, France, and England were some of the first to ban judicial torture. However, by the late 1800s, almost every country in Europe had an official judicial torture ban in place. Now this is where things get interesting, because seemingly the usage and subsequent banning of judicial torture was more or less of a 0 to 100 approach. It really kind of went torture was being used and now it's not. And the torture methods that were being used were more or less of a side note because, well, they were banned now, at least ideally. But that doesn't mean there's not banned methods we can discuss. Just bear with me. You see, following the huge torture ban wave across Europe in the 1800s, we find Europe and the rest of the world experience World War I and then World War II. And following World War II, we see the UN adopting something known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this declaration was officially adopted on December 10th, 1948. And what this declaration was essentially the first global recognition and statement of fundamental human rights globally. This declaration is much longer and much more complex than I could get into in this video. However, one relevant part of this declaration is Article 5, which states, quote, "No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment," making an extremely cut and dry case on what is and isn't allowed in regards to torture. And obviously, nothing is. Article 5 of this declaration essentially stated there is not any situation where torture is ever permitted, not in wars, not in certain emergencies, and not even in national security situations. Something that we could see as subtle foreshadowing. Now, even though this initial declaration was not legally binding in 1948, it still carried a massive moral and legal influence as it was a globally recognized treaty. However, it wouldn't be long until 1984 that the UN's Convention Against Torture would officially become legally binding, more or less making torture in any